From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
This is Times Radio.
Thank you, Carolyn. Some breaking news in the last half an hour. Merseyside police say they're dealing with a major incident in Southport. There have been reports of a stabbing and police say there are a number of reported casualties.
What made 17-year-old Axel Rudakubana stab to death 3 young children in Southport last summer and injure many more? It sparked riots in Southport. And riots beyond as well. But now, away from the sound and fury, beyond the court which found Rudakubana did commit the crime, an inquiry has been diligently working out to find out why he did it. And why mental health services, social services, the police, the anti-radicalisation programme Prevent and more did not realise he was capable of such an attack.
What occurred on that day has made it critically necessary, moreover, to identify all the changes that need to be implemented in order to ensure, as best as our society is able, that there is no repetition.
The first part of the inquiry has now finished. The story today: why wasn't the Southport attack prevented? Constance Kampfner is Northern correspondent for The Times, and she has been recently spending a lot of time in one particular room in Liverpool Town Hall.
In this grand wood-panelled room.
It's where the Southport inquiry has been taking place.
The press and the lawyers for the inquiry all sit around on these kind of plush red benches, and on one side, that's us and the lawyers for all the core participants. And then there's a big black curtain that divides the room so that the families of the murdered girls and of the injured girls can follow along the proceedings but watch in privacy.
And what's it been like in that room as various people have been giving testimony? I mean, is it sombre? Is it serious?
The tone was really set from how the inquiry began, and that was hearing evidence from the bereaved families and from the families of the injured girls, as well as hearing directly from the injured adults. And those were very difficult, very emotional days. So we heard from the parents of BB King, who was 6, Elsie Stancombe, who was 7, and Alice De Silva Agua, who was 9. They gave the most heart-wrenching pen portraits of their vivacious, kind, generous children, how excited they'd been to go to that dance class at the start of the school holidays, and how the families had just been absolutely ripped apart by what happened to them. We had really horrifyingly vivid recollections of the day itself. So for BB and Elsie's parents, they found out their girls had been killed while standing on the street, desperately trying to find them and getting told by officers that they hadn't made it. Alice would die later in hospital. But what we also heard from the parents, as well as that kind of commemorative evidence, was a real anger and desperation for answers. And there was this moment that I'll never forget, which was when Elsie's mother, who'd given her evidence so stoically, at the very end, she looks up and she directly addresses the inquiry's chair. That's Sir Adrian Fulford, who's a retired High Court judge. And she said to him, and I quote, "We lost everything that day, and I need to understand how this happened." We also heard from the parents of surviving children. Their families, of course, are incredibly lucky to still have their little girls, but have so much emotional, physical scarring to deal with. And they spoke about how their children ask the kind of most innocent questions in trying to comprehend, make any sense of what's happened to them. And they ask things like, what happened to make him so angry? Did people not love him? It was really crucial, I think, to hear the desperation that these families understandably have for answers, and it really set the tone for everything that was going to come next.
And there are so many questions around that, which they've been trying to get to the bottom of. But before we turn to that, why don't you just lay out for us exactly what happened last year, 29th of July, in Southport, this attack? What happened?
So it was right at the start of the summer holidays, a beautiful sunny day, and there was a Taylor Swift dance and bracelet making class being held in a quiet little studio just tucked away on a back street. And it was there that Axel Rudakubana, then 17, got a taxi to and entered the studio with a knife shortly before pickup, stabbing 3 little girls to death, injuring 8 more and 2 adults.
And so that the broad questions then, I guess, which the inquiry is trying to get to the bottom of, is what exactly?
So the inquiry is happening in 2 phases. So phase 1 is what happened in Rudakubana's case. And he's referred to, by the way, throughout this as AR, so as not to further traumatise the families. And they desperately want to know what could have been done to stop him. So that phase has just finished hearing evidence this week, and the chairman is expected to come back with some recommendations before we then launch into phase 2. And phase 2 will sort of zoom out and will examine this wider issue of young people and why and how they are being drawn into violent extremism.
Quite. And before we hear about what some of them have been saying, just give us a sense of who has been appearing at the inquiry.
So we've heard from a huge range of people, from social services, police, the Prevent Counter-Terrorism scheme, from Axel Rudakubana's school teachers, psychiatrists who were involved with him, really just trying to get a clear sense of how he fell through the system's cracks, what support structures should have been in place that weren't. But we also heard from some of the big tech giants like Amazon, who were called to answer questions about why this child was so easily able to order knives and other kind of dangerous materials online. We heard from X, formerly known as Twitter, about how he was able to access some violent content. And then finally, the moment I think that really everybody was waiting for, we heard from Axel Rudakubana's family, from his brother Dion and from his parents Letitia and Alphonse. And I know from speaking with victims just quite how desperately they needed answers from them too.
So let's hear about what's happened in this first phase then. So many different agencies and organisations, it seems, have been represented at this first phase of the inquiry, giving their evidence. Can we go all the way back to when Axel Rudakubana was actually a lot younger than he is now, and he was at school, he was sort of 12, 13, this is back in 2019, and there were, it seems, from some of the evidence that's already been heard at the inquiry, that there were some serious red flags being waved about his behaviour.
Yes, so actually when he starts secondary school, in year 7, he seems to be a kind of quiet, well-behaved child. He does community theatre, he appears in a Doctor Who Children in Need special. But it's towards the end of year 8, 2019, around the age of 12, that his behaviour starts to become more challenging, and he makes some pretty disturbing comments, like calling the Manchester Arena bombing and Ariana Grande concert a good battle. And by the time he comes back at the start of year 9, there are a couple of incidents where he gets into physical fights. And one evening, he phones Childline and he admits that he's taken a knife with him into school 10 times because he says he's being bullied. Of course, the school's alerted, and at that point, he is expelled. And he will never return to mainstream education. And really, it is from this point that he kind of appears to spiral out of control. And what alarms professionals then and on so many following occasions, and we heard this from such a kind of variety of people, is how flippantly he seems to be saying that, he did intend to use a knife, and how little remorse or empathy he seems able to show towards his potential victims.
Thanks to most of the evidence being recorded, we'll hear from the inquiry itself.
He had no respect for authority and generally a lack of respect for other pupils and staff. He was insistent that his views alone were correct and everyone else was wrong. There was never any sense of remorse or accountability for his actions.
I think he understood the consequence of the actions he's taken as it related to him, but not as it related to others.
You noted that AR had admitted to committing a criminal offence multiple times, carrying a knife at school.
Yep.
Though he admitted to doing it, he did not seem to fully understand the possible repercussions, nor show any remorse.
Yep.
And an officer at this point from Lancashire Police says almost 5 years before the Southport attack, Rudakubana shows potential for huge escalation.
And you'd expect then normally a child espousing those kind of views, saying those kind of things, would be referred to Prevent. Did we hear from them at the inquiry?
Yes, we did. Axel Rudakubana starts at a different school. It's a PRU called Acorns. And
what's a PRU, sorry?
A pupil referral unit. So it's children who can't be kind of accommodated in more mainstream education for a wide variety of reasons, might spend some time at a PRU. And teachers there are really alarmed by his behaviour. In fact, we heard from the head teacher of that school during the inquiry, and she said that, she's used to dealing with challenging children.
It's quite a small school. We have quite a challenging cohort. We serve pupils who, for one reason or another, can't attend mainstream school.
But that she'd never quite come across a child like Rudakubana, who was so kind of open in his violent intent and so unable to understand the kind of human consequences of what he was saying.
I felt like he was building up to something. I felt like something was going to happen, and that this kind of level of agitation and the direct challenges to staff and the way he was with the other pupils, it felt like every day it was building and building and building.
And teachers there refer him actually 3 times to Prevent. So the first time he's caught searching for school shootings and degloving online, but that case isn't taken up. And we heard from Prevent during the inquiry, and essentially they explained that this is because he doesn't show any kind of clear ideological motive.
At the time of it coming across my path, the case didn't formulate any ideology, didn't point towards terrorism. So the best point was to get it to an agency that would deal with that.
More of a mental health issue than a terrorism issue. However, the dots are consistently not joined between his offending behaviour and these various incidents. So just after being expelled from that first school, from Range High School in Formby, Axel Rudakubana actually returns, and he returns with a knife in his backpack and with a hockey stick, and with the intention of harming the child that he claims was bullying him. It's worth noting that the school never found evidence on that front. The child is not in school that day, luckily, but he does attack a different child with the hockey stick.
He phoned a taxi the day before to arrive at the same time as our taxi so that he could get into it. He was equipped with a knife and a hockey stick, even though Mum was supposed to be hiding the knives. There was a level of planning that had gone into it.
And when police are called, he is, overt in his intent. He says, that he brought the knife because he wanted to kill.
It's not unusual for us to have pupils who come to us because they've brought knives into school, into other schools, but his response was to use it, and he looked at me directly when he said it.
There's some clear kind of evidence of his interest in violence.
Yeah. And after that incident, did any agency follow up with him on, what might be going on here?
Yeah, so different agencies get involved. The first thing that happens is that he goes through the youth criminal justice system. So he receives what's called a referral order, a 10-month referral order. And that essentially means the young person has to engage with a variety of services and activities. It's kind of a way of avoiding any form of incarceration, but trying to reform that child's behaviour. However, this 10-month referral order takes place largely during COVID, and there are no recorded phone notes from Lancashire's youth offending team from any contact with him during that time. And then we know that post-lockdown, the contact they had with him amounted to just 3 30-minute sessions, which sound rather thin, to be honest. So he was taken through a No Knives, Better Lives worksheet. And the notes say that he said at this point he wouldn't take a knife out again. Well, he goes on to do that. So clearly that didn't work. A victim awareness session, but he apparently there struggled with the concept of kind of apologising and focused instead on his perception that he was being bullied, and an anger management workshop.
And throughout all of this, he is engaging with, or at least he's being referred to, correct me if I'm wrong, mental health services.
Yeah, so he is referred to mental health services initially because they suspect he may have autism, but it takes 77 weeks for him to receive a diagnosis. They also suspect he could have ADHD, but he never gets diagnosed for that. And actually, the inquiry heard that, an ADHD diagnosis could have been really crucial here. Maybe he could have been given some medicine which helps with things like impulse control. And it's again here that we just see a kind of complete failure to join the dots. So a couple of psychiatrists see him over the years, but they admitted to the inquiry they actually didn't read his full notes. And so they're unaware of the extent of his past violence.
Again, without going to the issues about the family, I've been through what was visible from the notes, which is many, although not all, of the longer list that I went through with you at the start. So how can it be, if you met your professional duties in that regard, that information was visible on the records, but you were ignorant of it?
Because it's not easily visible in the records, I guess. It's so it remains in the territory of unknown unknowns. If you don't know something's there, you can't go. You can't go looking for it.
Instead, one psychiatrist described him as an unremarkable, sullen, untalkative, gawky teenage boy.
He came across as somebody who wasn't interested himself in being there, didn't particularly want to engage, wasn't depressed, was euthymic in mood, I guess. He came across as a kind of, I regarded him as a average, sullen teenage boy, really.
And yes, noted that his parents were failing to impose any boundaries on him.
My sense was, why are we as a service continuing to bang our head against the wall with this lad who has been deemed time and time and time again not to have a mental disorder, and for whom this is primarily a social care issue of parents not being able to implement boundaries or willing to implement boundaries.
But essentially, there was no mechanism in place to really engage with Axel. When he didn't want to be seen, he just wouldn't come downstairs. He stopped taking his medication. And CAMS, so that's Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services, discharged him about 3 months before the attack. And that's despite the fact that he hadn't left the house for months at that point, and he was exhibiting very poor mental health as well as, violent tendencies. There's evidence that his family were basically afraid of him at this point and had phoned the police on him multiple times.
Constance, we're talking about Axel Rudakubana and what has been heard in this first phase of the inquiry into the Southport attacks, which he perpetrated. And it's fascinating to hear how just so many agencies are involved, so many different people, it seems, were involved with trying to figure out what was going on with him in the build-up to the attack. And yet very few dots were joined it seems like there are many missed opportunities. You mentioned a moment ago that his parents seemed so scared of him that they called 999 on a number of occasions. I mean, what can you tell us about any of those?
I mean, it goes without saying that to call 999 on your own child, things have to have gotten pretty bad.
Yeah.
So in November 2021, his mum calls the police and she says that he's smashing the house up, he's throwing objects. But later she says, no need to come round. Police don't attend. They just speak to her on the phone. Later that month, he kicks his father, he throws a plate at a rental car, damaging the windscreen.
The original details on the log were that AR had become angry at the food his parents had cooked him for tea and had thrown a plate of food at a rental car and jumped on the car.
Officers arrive, but they say that any kind of prosecution is not in the public interest. They note that he's autistic and that the father, Alphonse Rudakubana, is not keen to press charges.
PC Ward then sets out his rationale, reached in conjunction with Alphonse R and PC Hall, for not arresting AR, including that Alphonse R did not support an investigation, the fact that AR was now calm, AR's age of 15, and the fact that detaining him would now mean holding a child in custody in the middle of the night.
There's a really crucial episode that happens the following year, and this is often one that's kind of picked up on as a really, really key missed opportunity, and that's in March 2022, he's reported missing by his mother, and when officers find him a few hours later, he's on a bus, and he is carrying a small kitchen knife.
When we got initially off the bus, I can't remember who asked the question, but he was asked a direct question, has he got anything he shouldn't have? Yeah. And that's when the knife was produced from a pants or shorts pocket.
And again, he's explicit.
You explain in your statement that at some stage AR was asked why he had a knife. And what did he say in response to that?
Something similar to what to stab people.
I want to stab someone,
yes.
Is what you said in your statement.
Yes.
He mentions wanting to poison people. We now know that he was actually, at this point, kind of ordering the ingredients to make ricin, a lethal poison, and stashing that in his bedroom. But, he's treated as vulnerable. He's taken home and he's referred under the Protecting Vulnerable Persons Act.
As opposed to a potential risk to others.
As opposed to a potential risk to others. So what we're seeing here, again and again, whether it's from mental health professionals, whether it's from social services or the police, there is rightly a focus on, this child's vulnerability, his autism, what more his parents ought to be doing, etc., etc. But there is a complete failure to join the dots between something like being caught on a bus with a knife with previous violent attacks that he has carried out, stated violent intent, and actually to weigh up the risk that he might at this point be posing to others.
And the slightly shocking thing about that, Constance, is that you would think, would the police, when it's got this serious, have some kind of oversight? Would they be the people who might be able to look over all of this and join up the dots and identify that something really serious is happening? And if not them, what about social services? Because he'd definitely been involved with them as well.
Yeah, so Lancashire Child and Family Wellbeing Service, which is a voluntary service run by support workers instead of social workers, they opened Axel's case 4 times, but repeatedly closed it at points where the parents were essentially begging for them not to do so.
You can see him saying, will you still remain with us on other things? And further down, I didn't know that your service is time constrained. I thought that your service stays indefinitely. As you probably know, we'll still need your service, especially AR.
And there were several times where support workers would come around to the house and they did manage to speak to Axel and noted that he said some quite worrying things, some sort of extremist things. But also there were many occasions where they'd turn up and the parents would essentially ask for them to leave, or they weren't able to get anything out of him. He'd sort of sit there silently. And I think one notable example, again, of that thing I was saying about him being treated as being at risk as opposed to being a risk to others is that on one occasion, these support workers heard that he'd kicked his father in the groin during an argument and that his father had, as a result, slapped him. Now, all the advice at this point focused on why that was an inappropriate thing for his father to do. But, here's an example of this child who's displayed a capacity for dangerous violence in the past, why did they not kind of re-engage or escalate this at this point? You know, he's assaulting his father, he's potentially violent. But they said essentially that the threshold wasn't met and the service was time limited. And so by the time they closed the case for the fourth time, it's about 3 months before the attack in July 2024, and he was discharged then because of a lack of engagement. So he's never actually taken on by actual social services, apart from briefly during his youth offending order. He's always kind of stepped down to support workers and then they disengage him.
But throughout all of this, Constance, I guess that the people who many would be most curious to hear from is actually Rudakubana's family, what they knew or what they did. We have heard from some of them in this inquiry process. What kind of a picture did they paint about what home life was like?
Home life sounded, to sum it up, frankly terrifying. We heard, first of all, from Axel Rudakubana's brother Dion, who sort of painted a picture of how his brother got more and more violent throughout his teenage years and how, as he saw it, there was a constant risk to life in the home. He thought that probably his younger brother's most likely target was their dad. And actually, he said that he'd recently watched the Coen brothers film, No Country for Old Men, and that his brother reminded him exactly of the sociopathic murderer in that film who kills 10 people. He described how he'd lost all capacity for empathy and kind of just how regular it was to have these violent outbursts. So he would do things like, you know, hitting them, but also throwing bottles at their heads, smashing plates and glasses. And that was an account very much corroborated by the parents of Axel Rudakubana. His father, who was the primary caregiver, was most around the house. He described an incident where his son poured a significant quantity of oil over his head. This was after a conversation about how Rudakubana could be forced to leave the home if his behaviour didn't improve. And his father said that Axel then poked his chest and told him, and this is a quote, "If you get me out of here, this house, it may take a day, a week, or it may be years. I will kill you. Trust me, I will kill you." So basically, the picture that was painted for us is that the family were absolutely petrified of him. And his father, Alphonse, said that he was deeply ashamed of this and that basically relations had so deteriorated that it had got to the point where he was just doing his best to sort of obey his son, not to rile him up, and as best as he could to stay out of his way.
Awful. And were they asked, when giving evidence, about what they tried to do to try and mitigate all of this or flag it to anybody?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were grilled on this again and again. And look, there was a clear defensiveness actually to this day, really, from Axel Rudakubana's father, who basically charted how, from his point of view, he had sent a beautiful boy to Range High School in Year 7 and that he had returned broken after that expulsion and that alleged bullying. And he blamed Childline for warning the school that Axel had been bringing in knives. He blamed the school for expelling him. He blamed the next school, Acorns, for, quote, putting him under a microscope. And he said acting maliciously by reporting his child repeatedly to prevent. He basically said that all of this had made a very vulnerable teenage boy spiral. But he was asked some very difficult questions about, you know, was there any supervision of his internet access? Well, the answer was no. Why were the family giving their son money, which they knew that he was using to buy weapons? In fact, they intercepted a couple of these packages from places like Amazon and did absolutely nothing about it, just sort of stashed a couple of them on top of a wardrobe, but, you know, didn't warn the authorities at that point. He said, you know, yes, he was afraid of provoking him. And crucially, you know, there was an admission that he was afraid that his son would be taken into care.
And most scarily, I guess, there was an incident, actually just a few days before the actual attack in Southport that Axel Rudakubana committed, that really should have rung alarm bells with the parents and really should have called them to action.
Absolutely. So all of this is building up. And then a week before the attack, the 22nd of July, Axel Rudakubana actually threatens his father with a knife that morning. And then later that day, his father sees him getting into a taxi, which he's ordered to go to his old school, to Range High. He's got a backpack with him, presumably with a weapon inside of it. And he has to beg the taxi driver not to take him. And giving evidence, he said he knew it was obvious at that point that his son was planning an attack on his old school. There was a sort of obsession about Range High. And he said that he knew at this point that he and his wife would have to report it to the police, and that the risk here was no longer that Axel would be taken into care, but frankly that he would go to prison. And yet they didn't do that. They did not phone 999. They didn't alert anyone. Asked why, he said, well, they were going to, but that the school at that point had broken up for the summer holidays, so they thought that the risk wasn't imminent, that they had, as he put it, a couple of months to sort of come to terms with what they needed to do or to formulate a plan, which he admits now was a terrible mistake that he's ashamed of. And then, there are some real questions about the morning of the attack when they see Axel leaving the home. Now, bearing in mind, this is the first time he's left the home alone since 2022 when he was caught on that bus with a knife. So it's completely unusual behaviour. And yet, even then, they don't do anything. And in fact, according to Dion, so the older brother, their mother had actually found packaging for a knife that same morning. So the implication that he was armed would have been high. But the father denied that they had necessarily found that packaging that morning. He said that essentially he was hoping for the best, that he was encouraged, that his son had gone out for a walk, that this was a positive step in his development, and that actually the fact that he hadn't brought a backpack with him, he was sort of clinging on to the hope that nothing bad was going to happen. And yet, the inquiry heard that day, about 1 p.m, after this savage attack, when the father received a message from a member of his church that there'd been an attack in Southport, he immediately feared that his son was involved. And moments later, there's helicopters over the house.
That's difficult to hear, but I guess it must be even more difficult to hear if you're the family of those who lost their lives on that day. I mean, did we get any sense in the inquiry how the bereaved families felt about hearing all that?
There were repeated apologies from Axel Rudakubana's father. He broke down in tears when describing the events of that day and admitted that his love for his son overruled any kind of good judgment. But when he was then being grilled by the lawyer of the bereaved families, Nicholas Bowen KC, he said that the families wanted Alphonse to know that they had, quote, listened to what you've written, they have listened to what you have to say, and they have complete disdain for your excuses and the manner in which you have answered questions. He was then cut off, the lawyer, by the inquiry chairman, who said that comment was not appropriate, but that gives a sense of the understandable frustration, to put it very, very mildly, of the families hearing that evidence and just how difficult that would have been for them to hear.
And Constance, you've seen so much of this evidence, you've seen so much of this inquiry. They will be looking for some thread throughout all of this and some lessons. But I wonder, to your mind, what stuck out for you? It seems like there were so many missed opportunities. And even though there were so many people potentially involved with sorting this kid's life out and stopping this awful attack from happening, so many organisations and maybe even individuals failed.
It's from the kind of really minor things of, this form got lost, this email wasn't forwarded.
These notes weren't read, as you said about the psychiatrist.
These notes weren't read, exactly, to the kind of bigger picture of how our institutions kind of set up in the first place. And I think the thing that is kind of difficult in this case is that there wasn't one obvious thing that would have helped. There's not one obvious intervention that, well, if that had happened, this risk could have been contained. So just to take you through a bit of it, say his prevent referrals had been taken up. That's not a compulsory programme. He could well have refused to participate. And in fact, his behaviour suggests that he probably would have. just as he did with mental health services. Say social services, well, they could apply for a child protection order, which maybe means that they could remove him from the home or force access, essentially. But A, they hadn't seen a level of neglect, they said, which would have allowed them to do so. And B, who's to say that would have helped? I mean, our care system is not exactly the safest place for many children to end up. You could talk about something like sectioning, but, you have to be a kind of clear danger to yourself or others. And he was never diagnosed with a mental health disorder, so actually couldn't have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And police kind of refusing to arrest him. Well, police are given guidance where they're encouraged to consider custody as being a place of last resort for children. So there is not one obvious kind of person or even service that you can point the finger to and say, well, if only you had done this. And it's kind of in the tangle of all of this that the inquiry is going to have to make its recommendations, which I'm sure will be numerous. But it was very sobering, I think, when we heard during the inquiry from a senior police officer.
I think there's a wider point that I would like to make in relation here to what is a really wicked problem that we are wrestling with across agencies at the moment.
So this was Assistant Chief Constable Mark Winstanley of Lancashire Police. And he said, he has no doubt that a similar attack could occur in the future.
Sadly, there are other children out there with similar interests and behaviours that AR displayed.
There was a kind of mental health crisis amongst young people, and that they're able to gain completely unregulated access to the internet.
Where at the click of a button, they can see the most horrific and horrendous incidents, and they can go online and purchase things which, frankly, I see no legitimate purpose for in crossbows, in machetes.
Get access to weapons that allow them to carry out, on occasion, atrocities, the like of which I hope we will never see again.
The like of which I hope we never see again, and that we never find ourselves in the position where we're sat in an inquiry like this again. But I fear that it will.
And just to really underline that point, this wasn't part of the inquiry, but earlier this week we heard from Lawrence Taylor, who's the head of counter-terrorism policing, that since the Southport attack, Prevent has had a record number of referrals, and that it's estimated that just over half of those since January are for people of no fixed ideology. So that's what Rudakubana displayed. He's not motivated by any kind of particular religion or political ideology. Rather, he's one of these young men who are being radicalized online, drawn essentially to extreme violence for violence sake. And I think there will be so many lessons taken out of everything that has happened. But there is also an aspect to all of this that is, that society will always have dangerous individuals within them. This is certainly something that the victims have said. And that, yes, innumerable things have gone wrong in this case from so many different agencies and services that could have helped. And undoubtedly, the parents were in an awful situation, were not feeling that they were getting the help that they needed, and were stuck between being terrified of their son and terrified for their son. But ultimately, I think the families feel that at some point the buck does also stop with the family, that there were just too many red flag moments, and that crucial 999 call the week before the attack, or even on the day of the attack, it just wasn't made.
I've never sat through anything like this. It's tough enough reading some of the reports about the attack and then nuggets from the inquiry. But what's it been like for you, Constance? Having to absorb so much of this.
Well, I think as a journalist, you're primed to hear a lot of difficult things, to speak to people who have been through the most unimaginable things. And, sometimes you're confronted in courtrooms or online with very disturbing things that are difficult to kind of shake from your mind. But I think for anyone covering this story, it has to be one of the hardest things we've ever done. And I think that's just because of the kind of contrast of the brutality of what happened with the innocence of those victims, and then, you know, what happened in the days and weeks following with the kind of rioting that broke out throughout the country. Earlier this year, in February, I interviewed the parents of 2 little girls who were at that dance class who survived but were grievously injured, really very nearly died. And, you know, I think that particular interview and hearing so many more stories from so many other families, those are the moments, as a journalist, I think you can't quite forget.
Constance Kampfner, Northern correspondent for The Times. Plenty more from her on this inquiry and on many other stories over at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. But that is it from us today. Today's producers were Edward Drummond and Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Kate Lamble, and sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.